One of a Kind Clinical Research Center is here today discussing HAE with Bridgette, the HAE coordinator at the practice that she works for. Thank you so much, Bridgette, for coming on in today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Absolutely, and I've been a nurse for 18 years, and for 10 of those years I worked for a general surgeon, and I worked specifically for him. He was very particular, so I started doing prior authorizations for his surgeries and scopes. So that's actually how I started doing prior authorizations, is through the surgical side. And then I moved to Arizona and started working for the group that I work for now. I started out as a floor nurse and then progressed into the HAE coordinator role, which I have taken over, and we have several hundred patients in that.
And can you explain a little bit about your job responsibilities as the HAE coordinator?
Absolutely. So we have to coordinate specific medications that work well with specific insurance and the patient. So there's a lot of moving parts that go into that. You have to be able to say this medication will be best suited for this patient because there's different ones. There's injectables, there's oral medication. So each patient, it needs to be tailored to them and what they're capable of doing, comfortable doing. A lot of people do not like syringes. So we kind of need to lead them into a different direction. However, insurance does play a role in that as far as what we need to do to be able to get a prior authorization for that particular medication for those patients.
Okay, so you're communicating with the patients about what meds that the doctors have prescribed for them and that what suits them, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
And then the other part with their insurance, can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So when you deal with insurance companies, people think very broadly about insurance. They think, okay, I have medical insurance, so therefore I can just go to any doctor. No, there's usually a referral process because you need to be referred to a specialist. And the specialist needs to know what hereditary angioedema actually is and what it's based on. So then you have to look at what kind of insurance coverage for specialty medications. There are specialty pharmacies. Certain insurance only allows you to go through certain pharmacies versus if you were just going to get a regular prescription medication.
Right, so these patients can't just go pick up like an antibiotic at a Walgreens, like they're looking at CVS specialty pharmacy.
Correct.
Or some of those other larger companies that they're going to have to process this through.
Absolutely, and the process does take time. It isn't you're told one day, okay, we're going to start you on a prophylactic medication.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, people are like, I don't even know what prophylactic medication is, because when you deal with hereditary angioedema, there's prophylactic, but then there's also acute medication. So you have to keep in mind, it's not you just call into the pharmacy or send a script in. You actually have to then look into the medication that's been prescribed, an order that's been sent to you, contact insurance. There's a whole insurance verification. It's known as a prior authorization or a pre-certification that you have to go through. It definitely entails a lot of paperwork, several questions. You dive fairly deep into the insurance process. So once you do that, then you have to receive the approval. You literally have to have an approval in writing. They can tell you over the phone, yes, this is going to be approved. However, unless it's in writing, it is not legally bound.
So not just did you just have to spend 1, 2, 3 days collecting medical records to make sure that you can submit for the approval, you have to now wait a couple more days, maybe a week, for the insurance company to give you a formal letter of approval.
Correct.
And then what happens?
So the process actually is, once you submit a prior authorization with all of that documentation, it can take, insurance has the ability to respond anywhere between 48 hours if you have to send in an emergent or urgent request due to longstanding history of swells, to anywhere to 30 days.
Oh my, oh that is a long wait.
Yes,
Goodness.
So insurance does have that leniency. I always call and check if 5 days have gone by, haven't heard anything. I always follow up with the patient's insurance to find out. And most of the time I always get the statement, call back in 5 to 7 days.
Oh, that's so helpful.
Yes, yes. Or they'll say, well, we still have 15 days to get back to you.
I see.
So they do have a very broad base. Some are much quicker than others, and some will take the entire 30 days.
Okay, so they've finally, 30 days later, they've sent you an official document that they've been approved.
Yes.
Now that document has to get to the specialty pharmacy?
That is correct.
Okay, so then how does that go?
So then the specialty pharmacy, then you have to find out from insurance if they have a specific. They usually, most insurance companies have a set specialty pharmacy that they prefer. Some are just exactly that, just a preference, like they have a top 3 preference. And it's not like, we say CVS because they're very broad.
This first one that came to my mind.
Yeah, exactly.
You said broad.
So it's not like just going down the street, going to CVS, saying, okay, I have this approval. They will not have a clue what medication you are asking about. So then I have to track down the specialty pharmacy that will deal with this specific drug.
Okay.
So once I do that, then I send them an actual prescription with the approval, and then they have to start the patient process to get them in their system. Because just because you have insurance that requires you to go to a certain specialty pharmacy does not mean they have you in their system.
So then once you've submitted that documentation and it's in the specialty pharmacy's hands, how many days are we looking at as a turnaround for them to finally contact the patient to send them the drug?
It's an average of about a week.
Okay, so that's a week right there for them to just get to the point to make that phone call to contact the patient.
Right.
And verify what they need to over the phone with them. And then they're scheduling delivery at that time as well?
That is correct. They then have to get consent. So not only have I sent them the paperwork, I have sent them the approval and the prescription, then they have to reach out to the patient to verify that I did this under the patient's knowledge, that the patient knows. So they have to get consent from them. Since these are such specialized medications and they're so rare, they are not just going to randomly send out medication to patients without knowing, yes, this is the correct address. This is how we get a hold of them more effectively. It's more about efficiency. So if the patient doesn't answer the phone call from the specialty pharmacy or the email or whatever they choose as far as communication, that just sets it back that much further, because they will not ship it out until they have that consent and verification.
Makes you wonder how many attempts they're willing to make to contact the patient before they just give up, and it just gets shoved under the rug and they move on to the next
Some,
patient.
not many.
I see.
Not many at all. So that's why I always try to follow up and make sure. So in that vein of thinking, the patient also needs to be aware, okay, we've started this process. You have to know that, yes, you are going to get calls from 800 numbers or 888 numbers, whatever the case may be. Because let's be honest, most of us don't answer those because they're spam, they're junk, whatever the case may be. And so they cannot leave detailed information.
Over like a voicemail or
Correct.
anything. Right.
That is correct.
They have to just wait for that person to answer. And it's not like that would be a scheduled call either. Like, expect them to call after work hours on Wednesday to Friday. It's you get it when you get it.
Yes, because they have they're located all over the United States. Some of these specialty pharmacies and their phone systems. So you have no idea where the actual call's coming from. So it does make it difficult for patients, especially they're in the middle of a work day.
Right.
And they get this call from an 800 number and it's like, well, first of all, I can't answer it. Secondly, I don't know who this is.
Right. This is quite the lengthy process. So now they've contacted the patient, they've scheduled for delivery. Is it always that patients have to be available to take the delivery, or can deliveries be left outside? Do you know anything about the delivery process?
They usually set up a date and time, and they usually always ship them out like in an overnight situation. So say they got shipped out today, they will make sure it's there tomorrow.
Okay.
So that they actually have a time frame. Because first of all, nobody wants to have medication sitting outside, regardless of how beautiful it is. It is
we're not talking about cheap medication.
Very expensive medication. So the pharmacy wants to make sure that patient is available to get the medication once it arrives at their door.
Right. All right, that is quite the process. Goodness. What do you think is some hurdles for patients during all these stages here? What are some of the biggest complaints or issues?
The biggest thing, well, some of them are patients get very disgruntled about, they feel like they have setbacks. They finally are getting diagnosed. They finally see a specialist that can diagnose them properly, which entails specific lab work. Because we have patients all the time, they're like, I just saw my primary care and we did lab work. And that may be, but I don't need to know what your white blood cell count is.
No, these are HAE, it's like an HAE panel.
It is.
For the C4s and the C1s that they need to have drawn.
Exactly.
And nobody would know to draw those except for a specialist looking for HAE.
Correct. So we have to have very specific lab work done. We have to also have, again, that historical information. Patients think that we are asking a lot of redundant questions, but it's for a very important reason. Because if the lab work comes back normal, people get very frustrated because they're like, well, I'm normal. Everybody tells me I'm normal. We don't stop at normal, because just because your lab work, the specific lab work, because there's different types of HAE. And that is what we really need to get across to patients. Don't get stuck on a no or being told normal. Your labs are normal, because the historical information can be based off of something your grandma said years ago, something your dad said, something a cousin said. It's the fact that it is genetic and it has a basis of this person complained of having swelling. Okay, great. Where did they have the swelling? Well, she just said she's retaining water. Her hands were swelling. Her face was puffy that day. It's like, okay, but that actually means something.
Yeah, especially if you're having these symptoms, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That means something for a hereditary angioedema patient. Swelling is a huge red flag for us. So we need to know something that seems minute to you is very important to us.
Right.
We also have to follow it up with high doses of antihistamine, because we have to prove that your swelling isn't just some environmental reaction or an allergy to a food that you haven't eaten before, or something along those lines. So we tell people we have to put you on high doses of antihistamines so that we can prove that it's not an allergic reaction.
Right. So right now we're looking for starting to create that medical history of patient came in January 1st, complained of these symptoms. I got this lab work. In the meantime, I'm putting them on high dose antihistamines. We'll see patient back in a month.
Yes.
Patient comes back, antihistamines didn't do squat. They're still having all this swelling, and grandma's got swollen ankles and wrists every now and then.
Right.
That would build their case of just because your labs are normal, you still have family history and proof that antihistamines didn't work.
Correct.
This is going to help the prior authorization. Correct. That is quite a hard thing for patients.
It is.
To have to go through.
It's a process, that's a big hurdle for patients to have to confront, because it's like, okay, I wish that our doctor, who is a specialist, can just say, this is what this is. This is what I specialize in.
You can't do that, right?
Insurance will not take your word for it. You have to have something to back that statement up with. So the patients are like, oh, I was just here. I got to come back in 30 days, or I've got to come back in 2 months. Whatever the case may be. Yes, because we have to prove that we have done all the steps that are required. Yeah. Because they will not approve a prior authorization without documentation of family history, high dose antihistamines, that you actually have a prescription for an EpiPen.
Right.
That's very important too. Patients are like, what do I need an EpiPen for?
Right, why would you?
Exactly.
It's part of the process.
It is. It's absolutely part of the process. And it's not because we just want to load you up with this stuff. But in order to get insurance on the same page as us, we have to prove these things.
I see. And I can understand how that would be a hurdle for patients to have to go through and be upset about, for sure. What is available out there for patients? Let's say patients that don't have insurance or the greatest insurance to help support them in getting their diagnosis and treatment.
Absolutely. So there are, if you have not been diagnosed or properly diagnosed with HAE, then you need to be able to take steps. And unfortunately, without insurance, doctors can't send you to have labs drawn, have, this lengthy process started. If you've seen a doctor prior to, say, you've lost insurance, then we can go back with historical information if it was notated at that time. But there are some of the manufacturers, the patient can actually deal directly with them. Some of them have a bridge program, but most generally, it's people that have insurance, even if it's poor insurance, insurance that doesn't cover much, that has an extremely high deductible, that you just have the insurance to say you have insurance.
It gets you through the door.
Exactly.
And then these sponsors, pharmaceutical companies,
Correct.
Have programs to help them with the financial burdens.
Correct.
from
Yes,
taking on
they
these
do
funds.
have
That's nice.
some financial help. Not all companies, but some do, depending on the situation. Again, the background, where you stand. But that's also where research groups come into play.
Mm-hmm.
Because we have patients that they simply cannot afford the medication. However, we need to know that this is what's going on. So we can get them in with a research group. And the research group can then do the documentation that is required, showing this is what this patient, they were in this research group, they took this medication for X amount of time. This is the benefit they showed. And all of that is documented every single time they have to go into research. So then we can obtain that documentation to then submit and say, this is how this patient is actually dealing with being on an HAE medication versus being without.
Right. Some research trials will even help with the diagnosis process.
Yes.
If the patient doesn't, if they have a family history and they're having episodes of swelling and that they've seen a provider and they suspect HAE, some sponsors, pharmaceutical companies that we work for, will allow us to do some diagnostic testing as a screening for the patient to help them, and then hopefully they'll want to do that trial and they'll get some a chance to try some new medication. But then also, how many times does it happen that this community loses their job because of their HAE, because of all the time that they take off of work, and in losing their job they lose their insurance, which means they don't get their meds anymore.
Right.
We see a high volume of those patients calling research as well, saying, what studies do you have right now?
Yes.
I need something prophylactic. I need something in rescue.
Well, and we have patients that, yes, that's happened to them, or they're in the middle of switching insurance, but they have a 90-day waiting period. So they contact us thinking that we have samples, kind of like when you go to your primary care and they start you on an inhaler or nasal spray, something like that, they may have samples of. HAE medications are not like that. Due to the very high cost, manufacturers are not ready or willing to just hand over samples.
Right. All of our research samples are donations, actually. And patients will decide that they don't like X drug anymore, they can't return it, they can't throw it away.
Correct.
And they'll allow us to use it to help patients bridge or give samples, provided that it was prescribed to them from their provider. So sometimes that has helped quite a bit in the past.
Well, and that's where it benefits a practice, a specialty practice, having connections with research groups, research facilities, because we can contact, our research group and say, this is what's happening. And the best thing about it is 99% of the time, you guys know exactly who we're talking about.
Right, yeah. We're like, oh yeah, we can take care of that. Don't worry about them. Send them on down.
Yeah, because it's such a rare community that, and we're a fairly tight-knit community. So it's like, oh, yes, I know who you're speaking of. I know, what medication you're talking about,
right.
Without even having to go into detail. So that's extremely beneficial to have that connection with research.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much for spending your time today and going through this and explaining to patients the process, the issues they may fall upon, and why those issues are there. This is going to be truly helpful, I think, to reach out to people and let them know. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome.